Welcome to tonight's lecture. We have quite a treat tonight. I just want to introduce to our speaker for the evening, Sandra Schall, who is well known to the academic community. She headed up the Corey Historical Research Library at Rhodes for about, is it more than a decade? How many years?
I was there 30 years altogether, but it was 20 years in charge.
So she was there for about 30 years she was there. And then she left Rhodes to come to Cape Town, where from 1989 she headed up the African Studies Library at UCT. And I see some of her ex-colleagues are here to give us support. Sandra has done quite a remarkable piece of research on the subject of a group of 100 children who was abducted into slavery and then rescued by the British Navy and eventually ended up in South Africa at Lugdale. But I'm not going to say anything more on that topic because she's going to tell us that remarkable story. And just to say that her thesis, she did a PhD on this topic, and her thesis is at the moment, it's being published, it's in the process of being published as a book. So we'll soon have a book launch as well.
Well, thank you, Delisa.
So let's give a hand to Sandra.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you very much for coming. And I want to know from the people in the back row, can you hear me? And from the people in the front row, am I too loud? Is it all right? Okay. This photograph, this first slide, shows the Oromo children taken at Aden in September 1888. But who were these Oromo children? And probably some of you are asking, who are the Oromo people, for that matter? In 2012, there were an estimated 25 million Oromo people, approximately 34.5% of the total Ethiopian population. This was a gross underestimate, and today there are believed to be closer to 38 million Oromo, approximately 40% of Ethiopia's population. What is not in doubt is that historically, the Oromo have consistently constituted the numerically dominant proportion of the population. But today, as in previous centuries, they are marginalized internally as a political and economic minority. The majority of Oromos live in the administrative region of Oromia. You can see it there. Where is my mouse? You can see this darker yellow area with the city-state of Addis Ababa there and Diridawa up there, but Addis Ababa is one of the critical places to look at. But we're going to go back in time to the era of the children. This is a map of Africa by John Bartholomew in 1885. And on the right-hand side is a blow-up of the area of Abyssinia, that purple mass over here. And I want you to look particularly at this, if you can read it from the back, Shoa, that is the kingdom of Shoa, and below old Abyssinia were what were known as the Gala lands. Now, Gala was a term that was in common use to refer to the Oromo in the 19th century and well into the 20th century. But it's long been considered a pejorative term and was outlawed in the courts of Ethiopia in 1974. But that is where the Oromo people were living at the time that the story starts. And although the Oromo people occupied in the late 19th century a plurality of principalities, they were united in language, in religion, in political culture, most notably their unique democratic system of Garda, and significantly, a collective Oromo identity. In the decades following the abolition of the Slave Trade Act in 1807, the British Parliament mandated their Royal Navy to to act against vessels engaged in the oceanic slave trade with the right to search suspect vessels. In September 1888, the Royal Navy's HMS Osprey intercepted 3 dhows in the Red Sea, just off Mocha Point. When one dhow, the Alcatora, ignored repeated injunctions to stop, the Osprey's captain ordered his crew to fire their recently deployed Gardner machine gun, pictured on the right. Ali Kira Muhammad, the captain of the Alcatora, and 4 slaves died. When the crew carried the remaining Oromo slaves aboard the Osprey, they were automatically liberated. The Osprey proceeded to Aden, where the Free Church of Scotland's mission at nearby Sheikh Ottoman accepted some of the children. The rest were taken in by Muslim families in Aden or by other missions in Aden, for example, the Roman Catholics, and or they were sent to Zanzibar or then Bombay, now Mumbai. Now we're going back to that original photograph, the photograph taken in September 1888. By December 1888, 1/5 of that group had already died, victims of the rigors of their first passage and a myriad new diseases, primarily a different strain of malaria in Yemen. In August 1889, 14 more Oromo children, similarly liberated by the Royal Navy, but mercifully this time not with any casualties, joined the surviving group at the mission, bringing the total up to 64. Now, what makes this group of Oromo children particularly significant is that the missionaries at Sheikh Ottoman interviewed the children soon after their arrival about their first passage experiences using a structured questionnaire. These interviews resulted in 64 brief but very detailed first passage accounts. Now, the first passage is the period from capture to the coast in slave historiography. And such first passage accounts are extremely rare in the historiography of slavery and of the slave trade. The resultant detailed and structured narratives suggested the use of quantitative methodology to develop a cohort-based longitudinal prosopography drawn from the core documentation of the children's own first passage accounts, supplemented thereafter by numerous and varied primary sources. So you get the picture over time through each child's life and of the group itself. The prosopographic technique yielded a profoundly different and far more complex picture of the first passage, which has emerged as a much longer, more intricate, and more varied ordeal than hitherto recognized. From the children's narratives, for example, we can see where they all came from. This is a GIS map showing their points of origin, their villages, their towns, their regions, where they came from, where they were captured. In almost all the cases, the route from home to the coast was neither quick nor did it follow a direct route, and none of the children followed the same route. And this bunch of knitting on this slide shows all 64 journeys, every step, every stage of each of those 64 journeys. And one child had 27 legs to his journey, north and south, east and west, even backtracking on their own journey already. So it was a very complex process. In the 1880s, when the children's narratives begin, the Oromo were entrenched in the territories to the south and southwest of the Kingdom of Shoa. Think of the purple map. The territory of King Saleh Mariam, later Emperor Menelik II. In his pursuit of the imperial crown, Menelik needed to augment his material wealth and his firepower, as well as to expand his territorial domain. So he expropriated the lands of the Oromo to the southwest. Menelik's ambitions were not limited to these successful territorial and hegemonic advantages. He was equally bent on raiding the Oromo territories for whatever spoils and levies they could yield, including livestock and slaves. Menelik, as king of Shoa, had long benefited substantially from the slave trade and could be regarded as Ethiopia's greatest slave entrepreneur, to quote historian Harold Marcus. He demanded one tax for every slave passing through his kingdom, and if you recall that map where the Gala lands, the Oromo lands were, and how to get to the coast, they all had to pass through the Kingdom of Shoa, so that was a dead cert. And another tax for every slave sold within his kingdom. And with the monies accrued from the profits of this slave trade, Menelik was able to satisfy not only his tactical needs, but also his personal passion for weapons. His efforts bore fruit. He was crowned Emperor Menelik II on the 3rd of November, 1889, and many of the children's narratives reflect his role, however distant, in their capture and enslavement. Now, concurrently with Menelik's rise to power, the southern regions were on the cusp of the Barabalia. In Afan Oromo, that means the cruel days, or the time of suffering. This materialized into the worst drought and famine in Ethiopian history, extending from 1887 to 1892. Crops died, food was at a premium, plagues of locusts, armyworms, and rats swarmed across the country, and then the cattle died from the rinderpest. Famine, cholera, bubonic plague, associated diseases, and starvation took hold. It was thoroughly biblical. And thousands of people died. In fact, by the time the drought eventually broke in 1892, between 1/3 and 1/2 of the human population of Ethiopia had died. Nearly 1/3 of our group of Oromo children had been orphaned. That is, they had lost either one or both parents. Among them, a young girl named Bishu Jasa and her 2 brothers. This is a photograph of Bishu Jasa in 1889. Bishu was born around 1875, so she was 14 to 15 years old when the missionaries interviewed her at Sheikh Otman. Her parents, Jasa and Dingati, both died at the same time, when, according to her own narrative, quotes, "The famine was over all the land at the time, during the prevalence of a sickness which carried away a great many people." After the death of her parents, one of Bishu's father's slaves took care of her. There was a strong domestic slave institution in that region. Now, this is Bishu's own journey and her story. The slave who was acted as her guardian sent her in the company of an unnamed man to buy food in a region called Gobu. That's our starting point. While in Gobu, the unidentified man sold Bishu to a merchant for corn. It doesn't say how much corn, whether it was a handful, or whether it was a wheelbarrow full. We don't know, but it was for corn. Throughout the region, people were forced into desperate measures to escape starvation. Under such dire circumstances, some parents and guardians had little option but to sell their children into slavery. After all, such a transaction reduced the number of family mouths to feed. It also resulted either in cash or in a direct exchange for scarce food, as in Bishu's case. Atari slave merchants bought Bishu and took her to the highland area of Ancharo in the north. Lost my mouse. There we go. Here, they sold her to another slave merchant, who in turn sold her to a group of Ardal traders, a syndicate which dominated the slave trade near the Red Sea coast. The Ardal merchants took her via Darway, little move backwards, and then to the coastal slave entrepot of Tajura, one of the ports at the heart of Ethiopia's external slave trade. And here is an engraving of Tajura done in the 1880s, almost contemporaneous with Bishu's arrival there. At Tajura, she was put aboard a dhow, set to sail alongside 5 other dhows. And they were headed for the Arabian slave markets across the Red Sea, a very short voyage. However, the Royal Navy intercepted the dhows and rescued and liberated 14 Oromo children. There were 9 boys and 5 girls, including Bishu. They took these children to Aden, whence they joined the 1888 Oromo group, already in the care of the missionaries at Sheikh Othman. And there is the Keith Falconer mission at Sheikh Othman in about 1889. The girls are on the balcony at the top. And if you can imagine the height of the average balcony rail, and then look at the height of their little heads. They were very, very tiny, they were emaciated, and they were very fragile and frail. And down below, there were 22 of the girls. In that 64, the breakdown was 22 girls and 42 boys. And there are the 42 boys at the bottom. They weren't very much bigger either. Soon after the arrival of Bishu and the other Oromo children in August 1889, the Foreign Mission Committee of the Free Church of Scotland made the decision to transfer the amalgamated group of Oromo children to a healthier environment to prevent further deaths. They selected Lovedale Institution, one of their missionary institutions, situated in the eastern region of the Cape of Good Hope, South Africa. I'm sure many of you know Lovedale. And this is taken shortly before the children embarked, taken in 1890. On the ground in front of the children are 3 missionaries, Alexander Patterson and Matthew Lockheed. And Matthew Lockheed, we have a lot to thank him for, because he was the missionary who, apart from learning Afan Oromo, as did William Gardner, sitting cross-legged in between them, and he interviewed Bishu in the company of 3 other fluent Afan Oromo speakers, including 2 Oromo women and a gentleman we'll meet in a few moments who's also in this picture. But Matthew did more than that. When he arrived, he and Alexander Patterson accompanied the children, and when they arrived at Lovedale, Matthew set about ensuring that those narratives of the children were published by the Lovedale Press in 1891. And thanks to him, we have that documentation preserved. And that's what I found in the Corey Library catalogue in 1972, I have to say. So this was a long term in the brewing. And in the background here is a very interesting man. His name is Gebru Dester, and he was a missionary from Harar. He was not an Oromo man. He was, but he had been a protege of a Swiss missionary in Ethiopia, who was working in Ethiopia, and the Swiss missionary sent him to, first of all, Switzerland, and later to Jerusalem for his studies. He was a highly educated man. When he returned initially the first time to Harar, he was going about his business and came across a little child crying on the side of the road, a little boy, very emaciated. So he stopped and asked the little boy, "What is the problem? What's happened to you? Who are you?" And the little boy said that he was an Oromo child, and he had been enslaved, but he'd run away. Having run away, he didn't know where he was. He didn't know anybody in the countryside. He didn't know how to get home. He didn't even know if his parents were alive. And Gebru Dester decided that he would dedicate the rest of his life to caring for the Oromo slave children, not just this group, but generically, because this is a small fraction of the number of Oromo children who were enslaved. The slave trade of the Horn of Africa was a trade of children rather than the more familiar pattern on the west coast of Africa, which was of strapping young men ready for work on the plantations elsewhere. So he played a remarkable role in the children's lives throughout their lives, in fact, and a very influential man in Menelik's court at a later period. On the 24th of July, 1890, the children were put aboard the Rio Grande, which was one of the passenger ships in the Messagerie Maritime, the French line that would take them to Mauritius. At that time, the Germans dominated the eastern coast of Africa, both in terms of their navy as well as in passenger shipping. So there was no direct British passenger route from Aden to the eastern borders of South Africa, including South Africa. So the children sailed into Port Louis, and they took the first ever of a link-up between the Castle line and Messagerie, and they boarded the Conway Castle and docked in East London on the 20th of August, 1890. This is a map of territory that you'll all know, I'm sure, the route from East London to Lovedale. And when they arrived in East London on the 20th of August, Lovedale's Reverend William Moyer met the children and accompanied them on the final leg of their journey to Lovedale. They arrived on the afternoon of the 22nd of August, 1890. Their long journey and their days of slavery were finally over. But theirs was still, in fact, a forced migration. I mean, they didn't opt to come to Lovedale. They didn't know about Lovedale, but they were children and decisions were made for them. And made, I believe, the missionaries believed they were making the right decision to protect their health and to ensure their education. Here's a photograph not long after that of the Oromo girls in their Sunday best, little white dresses, red sashes, and red hatbands on their boaters. Under the stewardship of Principal Dr. James Stewart, the nature of education at Lovedale changed from its original academic program, fashioned along liberal arts lines, to a program of vocational training. Accordingly, the vast majority of female students were to be trained in domestic skills, like cooking, cleaning, washing, and ironing. However, Bishu Jasa had very different plans. Her intellectual competence emerged early in her academic schoolwork. In 1892, Bishu was in Standard 3 and ranked first in a class of 25 children, girls and boys, scoring 94%. There were 8 Oromo children in that class, of whom 6 scored in the top 10. At Lovedale's prize giving that year, she was awarded not only first place in class, but also the Class Bible Prize. But she wasn't alone. The majority of the Oromo children worked consistently hard, and even from Sheikh Ottoman time had always found the need for holidays hard to comprehend. They said to the missionaries, why are we having a holiday? And the missionaries said, well, it's Christmas. And so the children said, what's Christmas? And so they were told what Christmas was, and they said, yes, but why can't we still have school? And they actually were quite resentful. Then the missionaries at Lovedale, at least 3 of them commented in writing that they never saw an Oromo girl or an Oromo boy without a book or a slate in their hands. They took their education extremely seriously. Initially, Bishu went on to train in the Girls' Industrial Department at Lovedale, where between 1898 and 1901 she did complete that 3-year course of instruction in laundry work, sewing and ironing. However, she had absolutely no intention of being confined to domestic service. Instead, she had set her sights on training as a teacher, and Lovedale, to its credit, did not stand in her way. She and one other young girl did. This photograph is taken in 1898, showing the last 9 children, oh, they weren't children, they'd grown up by then, the last 9 Oromo left at Lovedale by 1898. Bishu herself is visible with the red arrow here, between another notable young woman amongst the Oromo, Berila Boko, and a young man on this side, whom I am absolutely, as near as damn it is to swearing, certainly, I'm certain it was Liban Bultum, who emerged very early on as a strong leader amongst the group. They married. Berila and Liban got married. But Bishu left Lovedale in 1902 to take up a teaching position in Craddock, a small inland town in the Eastern Cape. During her time at Lovedale, Bishu had befriended a fellow student by the name of Frederick Schierpers. And Frederick was from Uitenhage, and he had completed his theological studies at Lovedale and was ordained a minister of the Congregational Union in 1904. And about that same time, he and Bishu were married. So, Bishu became one of approximately a third, 23 children, who stayed in South Africa. The other approximately third returned to their homelands, and either together in 1909 when a big shipment left, or individually, about 8 of them decided to go home individually, even from as early as 1901, which I think took an enormous amount of courage, and they did it on their own, with their own resources. This group of children who stayed in South Africa, you could see the dispersal throughout the country. And a lot of it is, where they went was predicated by both economic and political reasons. Kimberley got the majority, 7. The lure of the diamond fields, but also because several of the young Oromo boys volunteered for to serve with the British forces and during the Anglo-Boer War. One went to Nopwood, and apart from the railway junction, well, maybe there were attractions there. Bishu herself is there at Craddock, and then the other young woman was at Wakito, was at McFarlane Mission close by. One young man stayed at Lovedale. He was ineducable, but his is another incredible story, but there isn't time to tell that one here. And he died there in 1948. He suffered brain damage, and I think, as of 2 weeks ago, I think I have a possible reason why. 2 went to East London, 6 to Port Elizabeth, 4 came to Cape Town, and then one young man walked on water, it seems, to get onto this ship. He became a sailor and headed for the US, and I last heard of him in St. Louis, Missouri, where he was a clerk. Sadly, by 1909, the other third had died. Their mortality was very high indeed. By 1913, the Congregational Union had posted Frederick Skeepers to a congregation in Bethelsdorp, a small town near Port Elizabeth, where he and Bishu settled. They had 2 sons and 2 daughters. The youngest was Dimbiti Bishu Skeepers, born on the 6th of November 1913. During this period, Bishu contracted diabetes, and by the time Frederick died prematurely in 1920, aged 49 years, Bishu was almost totally blind. She was only 45 years old. Dimbiti, who was 6 when her father died, followed in her mother's footsteps and became a primary school teacher. On the 12th of November 1933, at the age of 20, she married a 28-year-old Craddock carpenter named David James Alexander. Their first son, born in Craddock on the 22nd of October 1936, was Neville Edward Alexander. Neville had clear personal memories of his grandmother Bishu from his childhood in Craddock. As she grew older and her diabetes robbed her of her sight, Bishu reverted to speaking in her mother tongue. Neville recalled how his younger siblings were disturbed by her murmurings in a foreign language. They ran to their mother Dimbiti saying, "What's wrong with Ma? What's going on? What is she talking about?" And Dimbiti would respond soothingly, "Don't worry about Ma. She's talking to God." The principles and biblical values which he imbibed from his mother and grandmother percolated throughout his entire life, far beyond his embrace of atheism. One of the most profound of all maternal influences in Neville's life was the focus on the value of education. From her earliest days at Sheikh Ottoman, Bishu and many of her peers recognized that the key to their own personal liberation was education. This belief matured at Lovedale, where Bishu decided that her own hard work in the classroom would open the doors to an independent life and self-sufficient future. She discovered on her own that, in effect, her education would be her own personal liberation. As a BBC interviewer in November 2011 reported, the strongest parallel he, that is Neville, can draw between his life and that of his grandmother is the role of schooling. And these are Neville's words. Her real liberation was not that British warship, but the education she later received in South Africa. Dr. Neville Alexander himself received his tertiary education here at the University of Cape Town and at Tübingen University in Germany. As an outspoken radical and political activist, he was imprisoned on Robben Island for a decade. He was also recognized as one of South Africa's leading intellectuals. As a distinguished and pioneering scholar of linguistic theory, and as a noted educationalist who believed passionately in the intrinsic value of education, linguistic diversity, justice, and equality. He spoke out passionately against injustice throughout his life, and he spoke out with anger, frustration, and sadness when the country was swept by that ugly wave of xenophobia we experienced in 2008. Speaking at a public debate here at UCT, he said that we South Africans have tended to regard ourselves as somehow special and apart in Africa. Neville didn't believe that we are necessarily all that special. And I'm quoting him now. The xenophobic attacks of recent times confirm my view that we are an all too ordinary country. The notion of South African exceptionalism has been attacked by the many scholars, and the attacks on so-called foreign Africans have underlined the need for all of us to wake up to the reality that we too could all too easily be faced with situations such as those that have tested other African countries, such as Katanga, Biafra, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Mauritania, Rwanda, Burundi, Angola, Mozambique, Morocco, Uganda, Kenya, Cote d'Ivoire, and Zimbabwe. We can be certain that had he not died way too early in Germany in 2012, Dr. Neville Alexander would have been speaking out even more vociferously against the disgraceful xenophobia meted out to foreign nationals, including Oromo individuals and groups in our beautiful country in recent months. We would do well to remember and consider his words today. He also carried Archbishop Desmond Tutu's concept of us as a rainbow nation one step further, and I would like to conclude with Neville's own words. The rainbow, besides being an optical illusion, as an iconic metaphor of national unity, places the emphasis on coexisting color units. If the recent xenophobic events herald the end, that is, the disappearance of the rainbow, they may well mean that we can start somewhere else. My proposal is that this is still Neville, my proposal is that we conceptualize our multicultural reality in dynamic and indigenous terms via the metaphor of the Gariep, the great river that flows into the ocean of humanity. Its main tributaries, African, European, Asian, and modern American, that flow together to constitute the mainstream culture of South Africa, will, from time to time, and from place to place, under different circumstances, have more or less influence on the whole, but they do not disappear altogether. We can be both one and different in dynamic ways. We do not have to box ourselves into racial cages out of which it is impossible to escape, and for the preservation of which we are willing to lay down our lives in ethnic and genocidal civil wars. Only such a conception of nation building, of culture without borders, will do in the new South Africa. It will also open up the possibilities of freeing our minds and our creativity so that we can find the synergies between the most radical economic, political, and socio-cultural tendencies in our country and in our region. South Africa is the one country in the world, Neville maintained, where for historical and cultural reasons it is possible to demonstrate that a raceless society is possible. A society where, if we return to the sources of our Gariep nation, we can fill the notion of Ubuntu with humanistic content. We live at the Cape of Storms, which, if we change our angle of vision, is at the same time the Cape of Good Hope. And now this really is the final paragraph. When the Oromo children arrived at Lovedale in 1890, they were no longer slaves, but theirs was, as I've said, nonetheless a form of forced migration. And in 2016, we are still witnessing the forced migration of many Oromo individuals and groups. Today, they are fleeing widespread repression, arbitrary arrests, detention without charge, enforced disappearance, torture, and possible death. And today, the Oromo who have fled to South Africa are still experiencing manifestations of xenophobia across the country. While Oromo migrants and refugees have been seeking protection in other African countries, including South Africa, for decades, The recent Addis Ababa master plan proposed by the authorities in Ethiopia for the expansion of Addis Ababa triggered Oromo protests and heavy government responses, resulting in Ethiopia's worst civil unrest in a decade and an acceleration in the rate of migration. With the city-state of Addis being surrounded by Oromia, expansion for the Ethiopian capital meant land expropriation for the Oromo, the majority of whom are agriculturalists and nomadic pastoralists. Oromo protest against the implementation of the master plan gathered strength and assumed major proportions in November 2015. Hundreds have been killed, and many more have been injured, arrested, or detained. Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, as well as international news agencies, are still documenting the violent suppression of peaceful Oromo protests. While the Ethiopian government has shelved the master plan and Prime Minister Haile Mariam Desalegn apologized for the deaths in March 2016, the oppression continues, as does South African xenophobia. For example, the violence meted out to foreign nationals in Dunoon last month. During those attacks, a dozen or more Oromo individuals and families had their homes and business destroyed, their possessions and stock stolen, and they were forced to flee to safer areas in the Western Cape. Until the next time. Neville Alexander's words remain relevant and should resonate strongly for all of us at this time. Thank you.
Questions? Feel free to ask questions.
Hi.
Don't answer if you don't want to. I'm dying to know how the chap who died in 1948.
Oh, yes. Yes, thanks, Claire.
Unless it's a secret.
This is the story of Gilo Kashe, who remembered very little about his capture and even his family circumstances when he was interviewed. We know where he was found by the traders en route, and we know what happened to him subsequently because his story is told by third parties. But whereas we've had the voices, the authentic voices of the Oromo children, Gilo couldn't give much information. He clearly wasn't like that when he started on his original journey because no slave trader or slave capturer would take a child who was not mentally capable of fending for himself or fending for others, as he would have to in a slave capacity. So something happened en route, and there are two strains of malaria that they contracted. One was the strain of malaria, which is common throughout Africa, which was in the lowlands of Ethiopia. And the other, which is the vivax species, is in Yemen, but not in Ethiopia. So, but on the other hand, he himself was already damaged by the time he was interviewed. So it's, but one of the problems at Aden that was discovered, and I've only discovered this 2 weeks ago, is that he was suffering from, they mentioned his name, and he was in the hospital there in Aden. 4 of them were in hospital. And he was wanted by he was taken by the Keith Falconer mission. But he had to recover first from general dropsy. And General Dropsy, I was still in the middle of sort of pulling the threads together. I'm really trying to discover what's going on. But it can be a side effect of this malaria. So if he did contract a form of malaria, you see the boys, one of the things that you couldn't really see, and I didn't have time to point out, you would have seen it in that slide of the places of origin of the children. If you'd seen the boys, the girls were marked with the international symbol for women, and the boys were just a dot. And if you looked, you could see the boys' dots were on top of the mountains. And so I did a sort of three-dimensional examination of the locale and of the routes, using altitude as well as the latitude and longitude. So I had that kind of perspective. And the boys were from the highlands, so they weren't exposed to any kind of malaria until they went down into the lowlands. The girls were. The girls they were very expensive. They were the most sought after of all the slaves in the trade at that time, and especially the Oromo girls, because they were considered to be extremely beautiful, and they were sort of pubescent, prepubescent, and they were very, very popular, and so they fetched the highest price. And the traders wanted to get them to the coast in the best possible condition, and they chose girls from the low-lying areas who would have had a certain immunity to malaria. And there are studies on this issue in malaria where people living in the highlands are totally unexposed to those in the lowlands. So Gilo himself landed up at Lovedale. They soon found out that he was not educable. But he stayed there and was an amazing character. He's had David Darlow, a poet in the Eastern Cape, wrote 2 poems in his honor, one of which was published posthumously, in Gilo's honor. And Frank Brownlee, who was the resident magistrate there, he'd been in the same class, or had been at Lovedale at the same time, not in the class, but he'd known Gilo very well. And he wrote an extended essay on him. And so he's quite a remarkable man. Francis Wilson remembers him. He remembers Francis was about 6 years old, running through the veld near the Chumi River, came through the trees, and there was the river, and there was this totally stark naked man standing on a rock, soaping himself and washing himself vigorously in the stream. And the thing is that Gilo had this obsession with cleanliness, and he washed everything in sight, including the horses at Lovedale. He was absolutely, and in the poem, David Darlow says, I clean. He always wanted money to buy a tikkie to buy a bar of soap. I clean. And the others have bubonic, and he mentions bubonic. David Darlow mentions bubonic. So my first theory was that he'd had a touch of bubonic that had affected both his brain, and this is medical opinion confirmed this, that it was possible. He had brain damage, but he also walked at the crouching gait. And apparently this can happen if, but there wouldn't have been very many survivors of bubonic in that era. So it would be unusual. So I'm still exploring what happened to him and why. But he became, the other person who knew him, I don't know how many of you know Betty Davenport, who is a very great friend of mine since the 1970s. And she also grew up in that area and knew Gilo as a child. She was a child, and so her memories are not, neither is Francis's memories, all that clear. But I mean, Francis has this very, very clear memory of Gilo washing himself. And so I have developed that story and given a little paper a little while ago on that. But this is a new development. Okay. Yes, hello.
I knew Guido.
Did you?
I told you, I wrote to you, told you.
Oh, yes, my goodness.
I was in Lovedale in 1946, and Guido used to sit on the
That's-
upstairs balcony of the office where I worked.
Oh, that's amazing, isn't it? Yes, I remember that.
But, he wasn't all there, he was just very sweet.
Yes, he was very
And
sweet.
I think what I remember is he had scars on his ankles.
Oh,
He'd been fitted. And, I mean, it was vivid. I mean, I think those were slave scars. Because he'd been fitted as a child.
that's very interesting, yes. There were some. Very few were chained, but there were one or two. A lot of them were tied up. One child was tied up and put under a bed and kept there for a week without food or water because he tried to escape.
Yeah.
And
He was a real character there. He just lived there.
Yes.
We knew him very well. We know the local vagrants and what
Yes.
Road. You know, that's Guido.
that's Gila,
And
yes.
there's nothing wrong with him. He was always very kind and very
Yes,
sweet.
he was very
Yes,
sweet.
cleanliness.
Yes,
But I was there 46, 47, 40, a few times.
yes, that's right, I remember that.
And by the time I was at the hospital later, he'd gone. He'd died. There was something else interesting. The Patterson was interesting
Yes,
because Pattersons were basic to the Presbyterian work, missionary work in
yes,
the Eastern Cape. And of course, there's a town called Patterson. But I think he must have been the grandfather of Sheila Patterson, who was at the Bible school at Lovedale. There's a certain renewal of almost of the
Yes.
families going in and out all the time, you know.
yes, yes.
Uh,
Alexander himself went back quite early. He went back in 1891.
well, maybe it was, and maybe it was other Pattersons.
But certainly the Pattersons did proliferate, yes, yeah.
That lady's hand.
Yes, hello.
I was just wondering if you had or are going to follow up on the Ethiopians that returned to Ethiopia.
Yes, I have. Amazingly, I have traced two descendants of, but unfortunately of the same, well, no, that sounds bad, but both of those happen to be descendants of the same person, Tolasa Wayesa. And I've developed that story as well. It's amazing he went back. His father owned 4 slaves, and quite a lot of them. One of the most interesting things that I found out, and that I was actually very fascinated to find out when I was writing my thesis, was who were these people who were enslaved? Were they, I was interested in their status. In other words, there were 4 princesses, or chiefly daughters, amongst them. And a lot of the families were actually quite, in relative terms, well off. I showed you the photo of Berila Boko. She was one of the royal daughters, and she said that to describe how large their land was, that it would take, if you went on horseback, it would take a full day to go around the border of their property. That's substantial on a horse, presumably not, doing donkey walk. And so I was very interested in they were wealthy, relatively wealthy, and certainly not the drip. So with Tolasa Wayesa's father owning 4 slaves, when Tolasa went back, he recovered everything, but noted that he didn't get the 4 slaves back. But yes, I did. And one of the great-grandson lives in Canada, and I met him in Baltimore in 2013. He flew down to meet me. And then his niece, that guy's niece, so the great-great-great-granddaughter, I suppose, is living in Southampton in England. And I'm in Facebook contact with her. Yeah.
We have another question here.
Yes.
What a wonderful lecture. Enjoyed everything. And Frank Brownlee was my grandfather.
Oh my
So
goodness.
quite a lot
Yes.
of stuff there.
Yeah. It's a wonderful story that he wrote. He tells an amazing story about Gilo, where on one occasion all of the children had to go to the they were on a walk when they gone to the river, and the children had to swim. And presumably they'd all been taught how to swim. But Guido, of course, never went in the water because he hadn't learned how to swim. He was not afraid of the water. He washed himself all the time. But he was there, and the river was in flood. And somehow he slipped and he fell and he went in and, of course, got into trouble. And Frank dived in and swam as fast as he could to catch up with Guido because he knew what would happen. And luckily caught an overhanging branch because the current was very strong. I've never seen the Chumi in spate like that, but I'm sure you have.
Pure cocoa.
And it was rushing fast. And eventually, Frank got Guido up onto the bank. And, not sort of coughing and panting and so on. And Guido said, turned the whole story around, and that he'd kind of helped save Frank, and that he said, "But it was great fun, eh, Brownlee?" And so that became a catchphrase in my family. It was Robert and me. It was great fun, eh, Brownlee, whenever anything happened like that. So yeah.
My grandfather had a great sense of humour.
Yeah, and he said, I never quite saw it like that. But it was wonderful that he wrote. He was obviously very, very fond. As you said, people were fond of him. They were extremely fond of Guido. He was a gentle, sweet soul and very entertaining. And so I was very glad to have Frank Brownlee's.
There's another question.
Frank Brownlee must be a descendant of John Brownlee,
Yes.
the missionary up the valley from about 1820. But I wanted just to say a word about Stuart.
Yes.
What he chiefly did was to cut out Latin.
Yes.
To shift an emphasis towards more practical things. But Latin remained an academic high school.
Yes, it did. But
He produced all kinds of people, including Francis Wilson's mother, Monica Wilson, who was a professor here.
Yes, yes.
School in London.
No, the two streams did run, but I know, for example, Chief Mabandla, I remember Monica's father, David Hunter, was visiting him in about 1900, 1902, round about there, and he was still angry with Lovedale. He said, why wasn't I allowed to learn Latin and Greek?
There's a lot of criticism. I also come across.
Yeah, and it was, as you know, Alistair, there were the factions there. There was William Govan and James Lang who wanted to retain the way they had been founded originally. The institution was founded in 1841, whereas the mission station was established in 1823. So, but there was a strong opposition amongst the missionaries themselves. But it was in line, Stuart's policy was in line with Grey's, and it fitted in with the Cape policy, so that won the day. But Chief Mabandla was laid into David Hunter and said, why couldn't I? Why wasn't I allowed to? The white children were allowed to study Latin and Greek, but I couldn't.
So there's one.
Yes.
Are there any other descendants that you've come across inside?
I haven't yet. And this is, I am in touch with, as you can gather from my reportage of the xenophobia experiences and the families that had to be evacuated from Dunoon and so on. I know who evacuated them. But despite that, and despite publishing letters in the press, and I just haven't known. I've tried every means that I can, including that BBC interview, which was posted on the web in 2011. And Neville and I both participated in that. And Neville, by the way, was absolutely wonderful, so helpful. But I haven't yet found the descendants, any further descendants. I'm still searching. I'm not given up. I don't give up. It is curious. I have got stories about people. I know one young man who married in Cape Town. He was a remarkable young man, but that's another big story. And but he died in 1915, childless. And there were, I do know that some families, their children predeceased them. So, you know, some people who stayed, of those 23 in Kimberley, they lived in the Malay camp, and as it was called.
What did Neville know about his grandmother at the time? Did he know?
Didn't know very much at all. No, and I didn't know that. I didn't know the story, except until I went into Manuscripts and Archives in its old position in outside, not in the where it is at the moment, in special collections. And there was Sean Morrow. I'm sure some of you know Sean Morrow. And he looked at, I greeted him, and he said, "Do you know that your PhD topic is, or your PhD work is a topic of dinner party conversation?" And I said, "I beg your pardon?" Well, and he said that he'd been having dinner the previous evening with Crane Sedin and various other people, and this had come up, and I think it was Crane who said that it was me making that noise, that Neville was descended from one of the children. So it took me several weeks to pluck up the courage to approach Neville, because I kind of genuflected at the sound of his name. But I did, and thank God I did. He was the most wonderful, humble, helpful, kind, wonderful man, and a great hero. But he didn't know much. He did have people in Ethiopia on the ground there trying to go to the slave markets where he knew. He had seen the little stories, but he didn't know much beyond that. He didn't know much about it, yeah. So it was mutually a very, very good combo.
So it's a very, very small question. They're very disparate lot of children from
Yes.
all over the place in shows.
Yes.
There's no roots known in Ethiopia, are there?
Well, certainly
Just
the child who went back,
That one who went
he
back.
has, yes.
Yes.
Tulasa Wayesa settled in Addis Ababa,
Yes.
and his family is still there mostly.
Yes.
Just
That's
Radita's in Southampton, and the grandson is in Canada.
One last question.
Just a small question. How long did slavery persist in East Africa? Until the end of Menelik II?
Oh, it carried on quite a long time. It was still active in the 1930s, I think. Yeah. I don't think the slavery or slave trade has actually stopped, quite frankly.
Thank you very much. Shall we give Sandy a big hand for a wonderful